Well, good evening. How y'all doing today? Oh, good. That's good to hear. I heard Miss Patulli. People keep asking me how I'm feeling today, and I'm like, I feel like I lost an hour of sleep. That's how I feel. I feel like the older I get, the more I dislike springing forward. We all need to get in our TARDIS or DeLorean for the older folks and go back into the past and give a talking to the guy who invented that. Luke chapter 8 is where the study is going to be from this evening, Luke chapter 8. And while you're turning there, I want us to think about something. Every now and then there comes a point where one story crashes into another story. What I mean by that is there comes a point in life, and I think in everybody's life, where one person's story crashes into another person's life or story, and then maybe a beautiful relationship forms, like they become really good friends, or they become, husband and wife because of one person's life crashing into another person. There's actually an interesting story about this. There's a newspaper columnist her pen name was Ann Landers. And she had an advice column. Maybe you guys are familiar with Ann Landers. And one day, a woman wrote into Landers and was just telling her story. And it goes like this. She says, "My mother died. I was crushed. I was sitting in her funeral service, still overwhelmed. In mid-service, the church door opened, and a flustering-looking young man entered and sat down beside her." And she goes on to tell this story about how this, confused young man just comes in late, sits beside her, and eventually as the service goes on, he asks her a question. He says, why does the preacher keep calling Aunt Mary Margaret? And she kind of let it slide, but she thought about that. She's like, well, because her name's Margaret. No one called her by Mary, but she didn't say anything. She kind of just let it go. And then eventually this confused young man asked her, is this the Lutheran church? And she was like, no, the new Lutheran church is across the street. And so he was going to the wrong funeral, and in both of their moments of grief, they kind of got a little laugh out of it. Both of their stories came crashing into one another. And the interesting thing is they became husband and wife, and they've been married for over 30 years, I think is now. And so that's how it happens sometimes in life, where one person's life comes crashing into another person's life, and you see something beautiful, you learn a good lesson, and we see that in Scripture. We see that in Scripture in Luke 8. That's where we're going to be studying from this morning. Luke 8, we're going to be talking about the two daughters. So Luke 8, we'll pick up in verse 40. But one of the things we see is that we see the story of Jairus and his daughter. And then another story just comes crashing into that story. We see a different story that just kind of interjects right in the middle of it, the story of this woman who's suffering from the flow of blood. And then Jairus' story continues afterward. And so that's sort of what we're looking at here in Luke 8. Like I said, we'll pick up in verse 40. The text says, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Just then, a man named Jairus came. He was a leader of the synagogue. He fell down at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him to come to his house because he had an only daughter about 12 years old, and she was dying. While he was going, the crowds were nearly crushing him, and a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years, who had spent all that she had on doctors and yet could not be healed by any, she approached him from behind and touched the end of his robe. Instantly, her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Well, Master, the crowds, they're all around you. They're all pressing against you." And Jesus says, "Well, no. Someone did touch me. I know that power has gone out from me." Verse 47, when the woman saw that she was discovered, she came trembling and fell down before him in the presence of all the people. She declared the reason she had touched him and how she was instantly healed. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." When Jesus heard it, he answered him, "Don't be afraid, only believe and she will be saved." After he came to the house, he let no one enter with him except Peter, John, James, and the child's father and mother. Everyone was crying and mourning for her, but he said, "Stop crying." Only Jesus can say that. "Stop crying, because she is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him because they knew she was dead. So he took her by the hand and called out, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned, and she got up at once. Then he gave orders that she be given something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. And so we see here, all the Gospels that have this story recorded the exact same way. You have the story of Jairus and his daughter, and then out of nowhere, here comes a completely different story of the woman with the flow of blood, and then Jairus, we see the completion of Jairus' story with his daughter, and it's one story crashing into another story. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from reading these stories and reading these stories together. As a matter of fact, I expect that the Holy Spirit and Luke expected us to read these stories together because there are just so many similarities. First of all, in both of the stories, there's a woman who is called daughter. Jairus' daughter, and Jesus calls the woman with the flow of blood daughter. In both of the stories, the number 12 comes up. The 12-year-old girl and the woman suffering from the flow of blood for 12 years. In both of the stories, someone falls down at Jesus' feet. Jairus in the one story, the woman with the flow of blood in the other story. And in both of the stories, there's some uncleanness. And so all of these parallels in these stories sort of show we need to read these stories together and see what we can learn from them. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to consider these two stories, talk about what we can learn from them. I'm going to break the lesson up into 3 sections, not surprising at all. I want to talk about the woman's story first. We're going to call that the touch of faith, because she touched Jesus in faith. And then we're going to deal with Jairus' study, and we're going to talk about his trial. And then at the end of the lesson, we're going to put it all together, and we're going to talk about some things that Jesus is trying to teach us. And so let's begin with the touch. We'll begin with the woman's story. I want to read it again because I want to take note of some things. Verse 43. We'll pick up. Verse 43. It says, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years, who had spent all she had on doctors and yet could not be healed by any, approached from behind and touched the end of his robe, and instantly her bleeding stopped. And then, Jesus says, who touched me? Peter says, everyone's touching you. He's like, no, but this is serious. Someone did touch me. And so we're introduced to a woman who was suffering from this chronic bleeding for 12 years. And, that's serious business. We would read that and we would be like, man, that's got to be awful. But it's even worse for an Israelite woman, because the Israelite woman is not just suffering from this bleeding, but she's also suffering from like a chronic uncleanness. Because the old law tells us that women, during their menstruation, they're unclean. As a matter of fact, we can read some of that. Leviticus 15, you don't have to turn there. I'll be back in Luke 8 here shortly. But Leviticus 15 talks about this. Leviticus 15 and verse 19, it says, when a woman has a discharge and it consists of blood from her body, she will be unclean because of her menstruation for 7 days. Everyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during her menstruation will become unclean, and anything she sits on will become unclean. Everyone who touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Everyone who touches any furniture she was sitting on to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. And so this is talking about a woman during her time of the month, during her period of menstruation, and how she is unclean, and anyone who touches her is unclean. And this extends to just any flow of blood. We see that picking down in the next context. The law says in Leviticus 15, when a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, though it is not the time of her menstruation, or if she has a discharge beyond her period, she will be unclean all the days of her unclean discharge. And so that tells us something about this woman. It tells us this woman was suffering because she was in this constant state, this perpetual state of uncleanness. And that would have some serious impacts on her life. This was a woman who most likely suffered from severe isolation. No one would have her over. No one would have her over for dinner, because if she sits on this seat, well, now the chair is unclean and we have to pick it up to wash it, and then we become unclean. If she sits on the couch, everyone who sits on that couch is then unclean. And if we touch her at all, shake her hand, greet one another with a holy kiss. If we touch her at all, then we become unclean. It's unlikely anyone would ever have her over. And it's unlikely that she would have any visitors over at her house, because you can't sit anywhere, we can't touch her, and so she wouldn't have visitors at her house, she wouldn't be able to go visit other people, and she couldn't even worship with God's people. Because since she was in this constant state of uncleanness, she couldn't go into the temple. She couldn't go into the synagogues. I mean, think about the isolation and shame that this woman went through. She was alone for 12 years. Alone, not able to even worship with God's people. I mean, think about what we went through with COVID, only for a couple months, and we were like miserable watching worship, watching like me and Max or me and David up here sitting in chairs, and we're talking to an empty auditorium, right? It was miserable. And she's dealing with this, not even being able to be close to people, close to God's people as we're worshiping God for 12 years. And so it makes sense when the text tells us that she spends everything that she has to find healing. It makes sense. She spent all of her capital. She went to all of these doctors, and no one could heal her. But then she sees Jesus. Oh, and she knows Jesus can heal her. As a matter of fact, Mark's account, in Mark 5 and verse 28, Mark 5 and verse 28, Mark gives us some insight into her thought process. And Mark tells us that she's thinking this: if I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. She knows, if I could just touch his clothes, I will be healed. I just need to get to Jesus. And how does she know that, by the way? It's probably because she had heard the stories. Right? Maybe she had heard the story of Jesus healing the leper because, hey, the leper was just like her. The leper was unclean. The leper suffered from this life of isolation. He couldn't go anywhere. No one would touch him. Oh, but there was one man who touched him, Jesus. And Jesus healed him. Maybe she heard about that story. I don't know. But either way, she is convinced that if I just get to Jesus, I will be made well. And how does Jesus respond? Jesus responds by commending her, essentially. He goes, he says, who touched me, and all of that. You go through all of that. And then in verse 48, we see Jesus' response. Daughter, he said to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I want to think about what Jesus says to her for just a moment. Jesus, first of all, calls her daughter. I think that's significant because nowhere else in Scripture, no other woman in Scripture does Jesus call daughter. This is the only woman that Jesus calls daughter. And he calls her daughter in the other accounts as well that record this story. But this is the only woman. There are times where Jesus calls someone like the daughter of so-and-so. Well, that's quite different. And there are times where Jesus talks about the daughters of Jerusalem. But there's no woman except for this one who Jesus says, like, you are my daughter. There's a possessive component of what Jesus says. He calls her daughter. And so first of all, we see that Jesus is comforting her, showing her a serious affection, not infection, affection. She is a daughter. The Messiah calls her daughter. But then he goes on to talk about her faith. Your faith has saved you. You see, Jesus can see her exemplary faith. She was desperate. She was desperate. And in her desperate faith, she knew who she needed to go to. She knew she needed to go to Jesus. And I think her faith is actually put in contrast to the disciples. Earlier, Jesus criticized the disciples. As a matter of fact, we could just read it. Verse 22 of Luke 8. Verse 22. They're in a boat, and every time you would think that they would just stop being in boats, because I feel like there's a lot of trouble that happens whenever they get in boats. But Luke 8, verse 22, one day he and his disciples got into a boat, and he told them, let's cross over to the other side. And so they set out, and as they were sailing, he fell asleep. Then a fierce windstorm came down on the lake, and they were being swamped and were in danger. And they came and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we're going to die. And then he got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waves. So they ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, where is your faith? You see, this woman, she had faith. She knew if I could just get to Jesus, he can heal me of my problem. And so her faith is sort of set in contrast with the disciples. Let's talk a little bit about application before we leave this point. How do we apply this to our lives? I want to give us one question, one thing to think about, one question to ask ourselves. And that is, where do I go for healing? Where do I go for healing? This woman went everywhere. She spent everything that she had to find healing. She spent all of her capital to find healing. Where do we go? Where do we put where do we spend all of our energy? What do we put all of our energy behind? Where do we spend all of our emotional capital looking for healing? I think that's an important question. This kind of ties to what we talked about last week. You know, your religion is what you do in your solitude. Where do we go for comfort? Where do we go for healing. And I can add some other points that I didn't talk about, and I should have talked about kind of in hindsight in the previous lesson on last Sunday. Where do we go for healing? Do we go to social media for our healing? Is that where we try to find healing, is, just spending hours and hours scrolling on Facebook? How's that working out, by the way? Because I feel like for most people, that just doesn't work. I feel like for most people, they get on social media and they see everyone else living perfect lives, fake perfect lives, by the way, because it is social media, and then that just puts them into the pit because my life isn't like that. We can spend so much time looking for healing in social media. Real healing is found in Jesus. When I think about politics, because I should have brought that up in the previous lesson too, you could think of this as part 2, this small part. I think about politics because some people, they spend hours and hours and hours going to politics. That's where they spend all of their emotional capital because that is where they are going to find healing. That is where we're going to find healing for our country. If this person gets elected, they will heal the country. If this person gets elected, they will bring true peace. And true peace is only found in Jesus. Healing is only found in Jesus. I think that's one of the points that Luke really wants us to see. I mean, it's all over the book. You notice how Luke is just a really awesome historian. Have you noticed that? Like throughout Luke, we have all of these references to all. This happened during the years of Caesar Augustus. And he mentions all of this as he's documenting it. Well, the reason why Luke does that is not just to place Jesus' story in history. It's because he's actually trying to teach us something. And so in Luke 2, whenever he references Caesar Augustus, that's during the birth account of Jesus. And Caesar Augustus, anyone who lived at that time would have known that Caesar Augustus was called many things. There were a lot of things that people called Caesar Augustus. They called him the Son of God, number one. They called him the Savior. They called him the bringer of good tidings. There's one writer who talked about Caesar Augustus, and he said something along the lines of, if he never would have been born, we would have just been stuck in destruction. And that's how some people view the Roman government. Roman government, as a matter of fact, Roman government sort of had a motto. It was like Roman peace. It's almost like American freedom. America and freedom is like Rome and peace. They just went together. And what Luke is showing us whenever he mentions Caesar Augustus is Caesar Augustus isn't the Savior. He's not the bringer of good tidings, the bringer of good news. The bringer of good news is Jesus. The Savior is Jesus. And so Luke is kind of putting that to bed. That's nonsense. Don't rely on the government for your peace. Jesus is peace. And so sometimes we can do the same thing. Oh, well, we get all of this freedom. We focus on the freedom we have in, I think Luke would say, well, you have true freedom in Christ. So it's important for us to see that. Where do we go for healing? One day there's going to be a day where we realize the only place to go for healing, if we haven't realized it yet anyway, is Jesus. And that really brings us to the next point, talking about the trial, and we move to the story of Jairus. And so let's read that just to reacquaint ourselves there. Verse 40. Verse 40. When Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Just then, a man named Jairus came. He was a leader of the synagogue. He fell down at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him to come to his house because he had an only daughter about 12 years old, and she was dying. And so then we see the crowds crushing him, and the story of the woman kind of interjects here. But then down in verse 49, while he was still speaking, someone came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." And so Jesus hears it. He says, "Don't be afraid. Only believe, and she will be saved." And he goes on to raise her from the dead and save her. And so what we see in this section is we see Jairus' trial. He has a daughter, his only daughter, and she is dying. And let me just stop for a moment and say that is such a common trial for God's people. We very much live in a broken world. Lord, come quickly. But that is such a common trial for God's people. If you look at, and I use the Christian term loosely here. If you look at Christians throughout history, you see that over and over and over again. John Owen had 11 children. 11. That's a lot of kids. I don't know how they did it in the past. He had 11 children. One of them reached adulthood. One. Charles Wesley had 8 children and watched 5 of them die before they were grown. This is a common problem through the world. And we don't have to look at history. We can look amongst ourselves. This is a problem that people suffer. And so that's where Jairus finds himself. He finds himself here in this problem. And the text doesn't really tell us, but I kind of assume that he was in a rush. I assume that he is in a hurry. I think the text, it doesn't make it explicit, but I think the text indicates it, that he wants Jesus to reach his daughter before time runs out. And ultimately what we find out in the story is that time does indeed run out. And so what do the people say? Look, don't trouble the teacher anymore because your daughter is dead. And ultimately what Jesus goes to show them is Jesus can heal even when the situation is hopeless. But there's one, I'm going to come back to that here in a second, but there's one point that I do want to make right now, and that is, think about who Jairus is/was. Think about who Jairus was. What do we see in verse 41? In verse 40, we see Jesus returning from the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and then in verse 41 it says, a man named Jairus came, and he was the leader of the synagogue. He was a synagogue leader. And so I think that teaches us something about him, even though the text isn't explicit. I cannot say for sure that Jairus was one of the religious leaders who was opposed to Jesus. I can't say that. We're not told that in the text, but that is the assumption that I make. The assumption that I make is Jairus was one of the religious leaders who was opposed to Jesus. As a matter of fact, there's only one other time that we see a synagogue leader in the book of Luke, and we see it in Luke 13. I'll just read a little bit from that. Luke 13, verse 10. Jesus heals this woman who was bent over because of the Spirit. And so Luke 13 and verse 10, it says, as he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, a woman was there who had been disabled by a spirit for over 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called out to her, woman, you are free from your disability. And then he laid his hands on her, and instantly she was restored and began to glorify God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, responded by telling the crowd, there are 6 days when work should be done. Therefore, come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. And so the other time where we see a leader of the synagogue in the Gospel of Luke is here, where someone is indignant because Jesus is healing on the Sabbath, getting back to Aaron's sermon about the penalty flag. And so my assumption is that Jairus was against Jesus. He was opposed to Jesus like many of the other religious leaders were opposed to Jesus. But where does he go when he's facing his trial? Where does he go whenever he is looking death, not his own, but his child's? Where does he go when he's looking death in the face? He goes to Jesus. It reminds me of what Mary says in her Magnificat, the praise that she gives in Luke 1. And it's interesting because that Magnificat, it becomes like the theme of Luke as you read through the book. You see this play out over and over and over again. But one of the things that she says in Luke 1 in verse 52 is talking about God. She says, he has toppled the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly. And that's exactly what we see in this story with the leader of the synagogue humbling himself now before Jesus, and Jesus exalting this lowly woman who had been unclean for 12 years. And so what can we take away from this point? My last point will be a big point of application, but what can we take away just from this point? I think the application we could take away is, what is it going to take for us to turn to Jesus? It took Jairus facing death before he turned to Jesus. What is it going to take for us to turn to Jesus? Because there is going to come a point where we will realize that we need Jesus, and it will be too late. So that's something to think about. Let's talk about application just in general. What can we learn from these two stories? We're going to talk about the teaching now. I want to give you two things, and then we'll be done. First of all, Jesus may seem most severe. Jesus may seem most severe when he is doing the most good. Jesus may seem most severe when he is doing the most good. I want to think about both of these stories kind of individually on this point. Think about the woman with the flow of blood. This woman with the flow of blood, she touches Jesus, and what does she want to do? It seems like she just kind of wants to be healed, and then she wants to shrink back into the audience, right? She wants to shrink back into the crowd. She doesn't want to make a big deal about it. She wants to be healed and get out of there. That's what it seems that she wants to do. But Jesus has other plans for her. And so we see it. Verse 45 of Luke 8, verse 45, he says, who touched me? And when they all denied it, Peter says, being Peter, I can almost hear him say it if you've been watching The Chosen. Master, look, there are crowds all around you. They're all touching you. And Jesus says, no, this is different. Someone did touch me because power has gone out from me. When the woman saw, verse 47, when the woman saw that she was discovered, she came trembling and fell down before him. And this next sentence is important. In the presence of all the people, she declared the reason she had touched him and how she was instantly healed. And so instead of shrinking back into anonymity, Jesus calls her out of the crowd, and she's afraid. But what does she do? Now she stands in front of this entire crowd and she tells them, she reveals to them her shame, how she was unclean, how she had this flow of blood, but then she had been healed. She reveals her shame to this entire crowd. And some people may look at that and be like, man, how mean is that from Jesus? Just emptying all of her dirty laundry into this entire crowd. How mean could that be? But what was Jesus' goal? Jesus' goal is found in verse 48. Daughter, he said to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. What we see in this verse is, one, Jesus showed her compassion. Jesus showed her compassion. And he gave her encouragement. Because think about it. Yes, she's been healed, but now she knows what? From the Messiah himself. She knows that she is saved. And so think about the comfort, the encouragement, and the compassion that she received from Jesus. And so Jesus, he may seem severe at times with the way he treats certain people, or even with the way he treats us. But those are some of the times where Jesus is doing the most good. Think about Jairus' story as well. It's evident from the text that Jairus is in a hurry. He's trying to get these crowds out of the way. Like, you guys move, my daughter is dying. That's the picture that I imagine whenever I think of Jairus. He is trying to get Jesus to his daughter in a hurry, but there's this woman. There she is, and now she's slowing Jesus down. And by the way, Jesus didn't have to stop. Jesus is God. He knows what happened. He's not. I know the text may make it seem that Jesus is kind of confused. Jesus isn't confused. He knows exactly what happened. He could have just kept going and just given her a little wink and just kept. Aaron said that once. He could have kept going, given her a little wink, and just kept going about his day because he's got to save this daughter, but he doesn't. He stops, and he stops on purpose. He stops on purpose. And some people may view that as cruel. Why would he stop on purpose and let this young girl die? But why did he do it? What is he doing? He's teaching Jairus an important lesson. He's teaching all these people an important lesson about himself. He's not just the person who heals sickness. He is something more. It was the same thing with Lazarus and Mary and Martha. There was a point in Mary and Martha's life where they said, Jesus, we need you to get over here because Lazarus, the one you love, is sick. And when Jesus hears that, he could have gone, but he waits until Lazarus dies. And then Mary and Martha, both of them say, if you would have been here, if you would have just been here, Lazarus would not have died. You see, those moments when Jesus seems most severe are the moments where he's trying to do the most good, or he's trying to teach us something important. And by the way, we have those times. We have those times where we feel like Jesus is not in a hurry, and maybe he's trying to teach us something. And that leads to my second point. So the first little point of application was that Jesus may seem most severe when he's doing the most good. The second point is Jesus wants us to see more of himself. He wants us to understand him a little bit better. And so that's what we see here. That's what we see with Jairus. He wanted Jairus to understand him a little bit better. And so verse 49 again of Luke 8, when the people see that his daughter is dead, they say, your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. And so these people clearly have a misunderstanding of who Jesus is because they think that Jesus is only this guy who heals sicknesses, and Jesus wants them to see something better, something more important. I'm not just the guy who heals sicknesses. I'm the guy who has the keys to death. That's what Jesus is trying to teach them. It's like Jesus is telling Jairus, don't just trust me when things are urgent. Trust me when things are hopeless. Don't just trust me when things are alarming. Trust me when things are irreversible. Don't just trust me when things are hard. Trust me when things are impossible. That's the lesson that Jesus wants these people to see. So Jesus, sometimes when he's most severe, is driving us to see more of himself. And so, what do we take away from this? We need to think about that. There are times where it seems that Jesus is bringing us through this severe, shadowy valley. But maybe he wants us to see a little bit more of himself. There are times where we might say the same words that Mary and Martha said, where we're going through hard times or we're facing death. We might say something like, well, Jesus, if you would have just been here, if you would have just, because Jesus says, whenever I return, there will be no more tears. There will be no more crying. There will be no more pain. There will be no more death. And so there are times where we say, if you would have just been here, fill in the blank, would not have died. There are those times. But maybe in those times where Jesus is taking us through that severe valley, shadowy valley, he's trying to teach us something important. There's one last thing that I want us to take home, and that is in the words of the people coming from the synagogue leader's house. When the girl was dead, they say, look, your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. I want to think about that for just a moment. Don't bother the teacher anymore. There are times when that goes through our minds as well. These people believe that it was just too big for Jesus. It's too big for Jesus. Don't bother him anymore. We tend to have the opposite viewpoint at times. There are times where we say, look, I've seen all of it. When Mr. Schultz came in and he showed us all these people suffering in Africa, and my problems are trivial with that. I'm just not going to bother the teacher with that. Or we say, this person just buried 3 family members, and my trials, that's nothing. I'm just not going to bother the teacher with that anymore. And this story teaches us that those words should just not be in our mouth. Don't bother the teacher anymore. God wants us to come to him. And to put a nice bow on this and tie this into the invitation, there are times where people say, well, you know what, I am just too wicked. It is too big. I've done too much. Jesus knows too much about me. I can't come to him now. I'm just not going to bother him. We need to make sure that those words never come out of our mouths either. Jesus always wants us to come to him. Even Jairus, the synagogue official, the religious leader, who I assume opposed Jesus, Jesus wasn't opposed to him coming to him. But what is it going to take for us? Because like I said earlier, there is going to be a moment where it's too late, where we realize, I need Jesus, but it's too late. But that time is not now. That time is not today. Fact of the matter is, there is nothing else that's going to heal any one of us in here except for Jesus. And so you need Jesus, and I need him too. And so maybe there's someone here this evening who, I had to think about it because I get morning and evening confused a little bit. Or maybe someone here this evening who knows that they need Jesus. Whether the problem is big or whether it's small, you need to approach Jesus and touch the hem of his garment. Why don't you do that this evening? Or maybe there's someone who wants to become a child of God. You want to be buried with Christ in baptism, raised to walk in newness of life. You've been putting it off because you think, I'm just too bad. I don't want to bother the Savior. Let's get rid of that thought. We're not bothering Jesus. Come to him. Grab his garment as we stand and as we sing.